welcome to Shelter in Solidarity. I'm glad to be joining you this evening. Normally we would say we're coming to you live from Dorchester, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, that's not the case tonight. I'm joining you from Hell's Kitchen, New York City. And this is a soft reboot of the Shelter in Solidarity series. After a brief hiatus, we're starting up with a show dealing with the topic addressed some 2 years ago at the second post-capitalism conference. We welcome back Nicola Walters and David Cobb, both of whom have been on not only Shelter in Solidarity, previous Shelter in Solidarity shows, but have addressed us on a number of other topics as well. Joining me tonight as co-host is Mark Soderstrom. Mark will introduce himself, but he's also another Shelter in Solidarity regular. The theme tonight is the Decolonizing Economics Summit, the fourth edition of the Post-Capitalism Conference. Our two speakers, our two panelists, conversationalists, are David Cobb and Nicola Walters. David serves as Advancement Manager for the Wiyot Tribe's Dishgamu Community Land Trust and as coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. He's also on the board of a number of other organizations that we may have a chance to talk more about a little bit later. Nicola Walters is the summit coordinator, the Decolonizing Economics Summit coordinator, and she's also a lecturer in politics at Poly Humboldt. She's a labor organizer with the California Faculty Association and a founder member of the Higher Education Labor United. I, at this point, will turn to Mark.
Thank you, Seren. I'm coming to you from Syracuse, New York, the wonder of Zoom that Boston, New York, Humboldt, all over the country, sometimes the world. Nicola and David, thank you so much for being here, for returning to our show. It is lovely to see you both again. I'd love it if you would open by telling us a little bit about the conference that's coming up, the summit. What are some of the expectations, the goals, and a little bit of the history of how this summit and conference has evolved over the years? What brought it together?
Well, thank you so much for having us here today. It is great to return to Shelter in Solidarity. We were reflecting on how many rich conversations we've had with y'all. And so it's such a pleasure to be invited back to talk about this conference. So I'll pick up some pieces of that, and maybe David can also fill in some of the development of this conference. As you were mentioning, this is the fourth edition. So the Post-Capitalism Conference was in person the first year, and then we transitioned to be fully remote, and this is when I first became involved with the conference. And when we did things remote in 2021, I guess it was now, it's so funny looking back to these times, that was really all of us figuring out in Zoom worlds and with new technologies how to host conferences virtually, doing things in ways that we really hadn't done before. And so our team was quite small. Is made up of a couple of faculty members, David and Ruthie Engelke, who's was a part of our conference then, and David's partner, a student from Humboldt, and we really just put it together. And we're 4 days, 4 jam-packed days of amazing panels and presentations, learning with one another about post-capitalism. A lot of the themes that you'll see for this year are kind of developing conversations that have been part of that those earlier times of the conference. And last year, we had a chance to kind of tighten things up a little bit, I would say, with some of our conference offerings. We're in our third year. We had a little bit more support coming from our communities and networks. So thinking about how we're actually, taking the conference to different levels and expanding the ways that we are paying honorariums to our speakers and presenters and shifting the focus. So last year became, because of some conversations and work that David can speak to as well, that shifted us from just thinking about post-capitalism to very specifically decolonizing economics. So that's when we transitioned from being the Post-Capitalism Conference to Decolonizing Economics Summit, last year, the third annual post-capitalism conference, and this year, our fourth annual post-capitalism conference. So not just the name change, but the ways that we were organizing meant that we started working in partnership with Dishgamu Community Land Trust through the Wiyot tribe, and thinking about the kinds of work that we were doing related to Humboldt. I myself have been in Eugene for the last couple of years, Eugene, Oregon. So you're actually bringing in more folks from around the country in different places. But from thinking about those collaborations, thinking about our work differently, trying to position some of the conversations that we're having around post-capitalism as interacting explicitly with Indigenous ideology, perspectives, the practices of sovereignty and land back, and lots of things that you can see from last year's offerings that are on our website, to today, where we're entering into the second year of exploring this theme. And it really is a challenge to us as the organizers to think about topics in different ways. It was a challenge last year for people who maybe didn't see their work intersecting with decolonizing economics and really had to stop and think about being involved with solidarity economy work or being involved with post-capitalism type thinking in different capacities, but not thinking about that intersection, which is important to the conference core at this point and is reflected in how, with the team that we have organizing now, with communications lead organizer, fundraising lead organizer, coordination, a lot of these kinds of structures that are helping us to put together what I'm so excited to see actually land next week. But with this also growing network of people who are involved with Native Roots Network, with our Native American and our Native American Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt, just thinking about the different kinds of people that are engaged with this work from different perspectives, coming together to organize, and it's translating into a conference that I think just gets stronger and more appropriately positioned with the time and the thinking of what we're trying to grapple with as a society. So that's my sort of brief history synopsis, but there's a lot there and I didn't cover even a fraction of it. So I don't know, David, if you want to pick up or fill in some of those pieces of how we got to even where we are right now.
Well, thank you so much, Nicola. And like you, I want to start by really acknowledging and thanking Shelter and Solidarity. I remember those COVID days in the early stages and being both a participant and viewer of some of the programs and then having the honor of being a guest. And I really want to lift up the fact that part of what I learned from y'all was the real importance of art and culture into our political analysis and having a level of rigor around our political inquiry and a celebration, again, of music and poetry. And so I honor that. And that journey is not dissimilar to the journey that Nicola just described. I want to start by saying I have the honor of being an employee of the Wiyot tribe. I live, work, play, and pray on Wiyot ancestral territory, but I'm a guest here. And y'all, my mama and papa, that's Southern for grandparents who helped to raise me, they taught me how to be a good guest to and with humans. And Surin, if you have me over to dinner, you've seen it. I will help wash the dishes. It's how I was raised. If anybody has me over for the night in the spare bedroom, I'll make the bed the next day. It's how I was raised. Y'all, my mama, papa taught me how to be a good guest to and with humans. But it pains me to acknowledge, because I love my mama, I love mama, papa, but they did not teach me how to be a good guest to and with the land because they did not know. They did not know because it was not taught to them. Because what I've come to understand is the last time my ancestors were in right relationship with land and all of creation was hundreds of years ago in Scotland and Ireland, and my ancestors were traumatized pushed off the land by the English Empire and driven to this continent, where they then traumatized people and pushed them off the land. So I am both a descendant of traumatized and traumatizer. The point I'm making by all of this is there's plenty of fucking trauma to go around. I'm not interested in shame. I'm not interested in blame. I'm interested in healing the generational trauma of myself, of other people, and of the land. And what the Wiyot people are teaching me is that by healing ourselves together and each other, we heal the land and we heal each other. And our past has to be confronted, but it need not be our future. I can be a proper guest, and never Wiyot person has ever told me, you have to leave, David. What many of them said is, we need to teach you to be here differently. And that is an invitation to the Decolonizing Economics Summit to do the work of decolonizing our minds. Think about, yes, economics, absolutely policies, absolutely. And how do we be here differently? So I'm excited about the evolution from a post-capitalism conference to a decolonizing economics one, and want to extend a personal invitation to everyone either watching live or listening to this recording. Go to decolonizingeconomicsummit.org and join us in this journey together.
David, you've been a guest at my house and you're definitely welcome back anytime. But as you pointed out, this is not an individual question. It's a question of how we've trained to relate to the big structures defining our lives. But I'd like to take a step back and address a question to both you and Nicola, which is as follows. Nicola gave us a sense of the progression of the conference, a deepening of your understanding from post-capitalism to decolonizing economics. My question is, most people who we deal with in our everyday lives can't imagine a post-capitalism, and they can't even imagine a capitalism as a system. They just think it's a natural occurring set of relationships that they confront in their everyday lives. So as you have been deepening your consciousness and involving organizations with a deep respect for the for Indigenous people, Indigenous ways of relating to the land and our entire productive infrastructure, my question is, how do we communicate these vital concepts to the broad mass of society? And I'll say, why don't we go back to David, and then maybe Nicola could also help us with this.
Well, thank you, sir. And thank you for the framing of that question, because I want to be very explicit with viewers of Shelter and Solidarity. The way that I'm talking now is not how I talk in a pool hall or a bowling alley, right? Like the point of the Decolonizing Economics Summit is to bring some of the best thinkers, theorists, and practitioners into a community of practice to share, right? So it's sort of like this, one would not read, one need not be a Talmudic scholar to be a good Jew, right? Like having good ethics as a Jewish person, one can easily understand that, right? Now, being a Talmudic scholar will give you a level of precision and an intellectual framework that is super helpful. So think about it that way, right? What you're hearing from me and Nicola and from Mark and Søren and the panelists over the Decolonizing Economics Summit, it's designed mostly for people who have thought deeply and are still thinking deeply and grappling with it. But let me tell you how I would, in a pool hall or a bowling alley, actually talk about decolonizing economics. I'd go like this. I reckon that the boss man has had his boot on my neck since I was 16 years old and realized how this system worked. And I didn't like it then, and I don't like it as a 60-year-old man now. And I've come to realize that this economic system that they sold me, and I reckon you too, was, oh, hard work gets paid off. And you know what I found in life? Hard work gets you a broken back and bony fingers, but we just make other people rich. So I have a suspicion about both concentrated power of corporations and of government, but also of the boss man. And I'll tell you, with that framework, I can get into some of the deepest, most profound conversation of what surplus value means with people who are drinking beer at a pool hall. People don't need to be educated that the system is exploitive or oppressive, right? So what we do need to do, I believe, is two things. One, confront the history of white supremacy and settler colonialism and what that means, but also to point out that there is a way forward in changing social relations. Like, I can have deep, meaningful Marxist conversation without ever using the word proletariat, without ever saying social reproduction, without ever saying surplus value. But you have to be good at it to be able to translate it into what I'd call working people language. So I hope, Søren, that I'm getting at what you're asking.
Definitely, you've gotten at it. I'd like to also hear from Nicola about this too. I would just say one other thing, though. It's not only about the language we use, obviously, it's about the circumstances under which we meet people, right? And I would like to come to that a bit later on, because you're a genius at organizing circumstances and projects that actually relate to ordinary people, not necessarily in pool halls, but elsewhere. Nicola?
Thank you, sir. And so I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that part of like what David has been talking about has just been inspiring a lot of the thinking about how we approach these conversations. And so, you know, I have to constantly recognize in the work that I'm doing, the land that I'm on, that where I work for at Poly Humboldt is situated on the ancestral territory of the Wiyot people. That where I live in Eugene, Oregon is on the ancestral land of the Kalapuya people. So thinking about these relationships and these histories is so vital to how we come to this conversation. And I laugh too, because not just this conversation, but as a labor organizer, this is vital to how we organize around good contracts, fair working conditions. I work as a higher ed labor organizer with the California Faculty Association, with Higher Ed Labor United. And so part of my curiosity is how I get people around me in different positions from myself with different backgrounds and experiences to feel the unity of union organizing, to understand what it is that we're organizing against and why standing together arm in arm on a strike line is so important, that we have each other's backs, that we're going to show up for that, and we know what we're fighting for. And so those are basic conversations when we're going to our working conditions. It looks like what David was talking about of we're looking for basic respect. We're looking for basic care for one another. And we're also looking for care of the earth as well. I just came from union conversations where we're talking about how do we think about a contract as we approach a reopener of our contract negotiations that looks into the future and takes into consideration the changing climate that is going to make living and working harder for us. So this is a roundabout way of saying that we're all having conversations around economics, around the experiences that are shaping our living and working environments. And when we're talking about decolonizing economics, we have to be bringing that history of how we got to where we are into focus. It's not separate from these spaces. It's integral to us understanding one another, and it's integral to us knowing how we can potentially move forward in a way that doesn't continue to replicate past harms. And so we constantly are in a conversation. I don't want to tiptoe, like I don't want to skirt the actual specificness of the specificity of your question, because I actually feel like you're asking us to speak a little bit about what this really looks like. And I will be honest to say, when I say that this is actually part of our organizing conversations for the conference in particular, that we have to stop and think, what do we mean by decolonizing economics? What does that look like? What are we advocating for? What is the world after this? And so you'll see on the first day, our second session is what is decolonizing economics? We're talking about this question and the different approaches that people who have been thinking about this from different angles and perspectives are bringing to that conversation. So this is something that we are constantly reconciling, as David says. This is a learning experience that he's gone through in his life. It's a learning experience that I'm going through. You know, we're all going through this simultaneously in our lives as we're trying to figure out how we organize around topics that feel so messy and unclear as this. But this is the work that we do. And if I could speak for just one more second, I was laughing to myself because I do this exercise with my students in my environmental politics course at Poly Humboldt, where I give them 3 scenarios. And this is the class that I had earlier today. Scenario 1 is that they have, in small groups, 10 minutes to figure out how they're going to survive a zombie apocalypse. They have 10 minutes to figure it out. They go off, they work on it, they come back with their suggestions. We always have Team Costco. We had today Team Nomads, and then we had Team go off into rural area and build their fortress and secure their surroundings. After they think about their zombie apocalypse survival plan, the second scenario is it's the end of capitalism. You have 10 minutes for your plan to, to develop your plan with your groups. They go off and do that. They come back and the questions start to change a little bit. Sometimes people imagine things exactly like a zombie apocalypse. But today the conversation was different because people are interacting a little bit more thoughtfully with capitalism and are thinking a little bit more complexly about capitalism as I think the conversation around post-capitalism and the advent of capitalism is becoming more of a conversation to be had. Just like, we have references for zombies, but when we're thinking about post-capitalism, that feels a little bit harder for students. But the third scenario is now implement what we would imagine as the joyful economy. You have 10 minutes to think about what this would look like. And I really feel like this is leading us to the conference next week of what is the joyful economy? What does it look like? How does decolonizing economics fit square in the center of that, at the heart of that work? And let's start to see how this isn't something that we need to develop from nothing, that actually this is the work that's already in practice, and this conference is a celebration of that.
Wow, so much to think about.
Zombies.
I'm a fan. I think I want zombies in my coalition, right? They're the modern figure of the worker as opposed to the vampire bourgeoisie, right?
Oh God.
We're kin. But I think, but speaking of coalition, right? I think, you've both sort of talked broadly about how to reach across communities, right? From labor unions to pool halls, and I'm an aficionado of pool hall politics. So a practical question at the moment, from labor unions to students to pool halls to bowling alleys to indigenous communities to your local community board. I was impressed when Seren put the slides up at the sponsor list that this conference has. It's really stunning work that you have put up, that you have gathered that together across such a disparate set of perspectives and political approaches. I think there's a valuable lesson there for all of us who are trying to encourage social change at the moment of how do you build and maintain this kind of a coalition? What can bring unity across differences without trying to erase those differences? And I'd be curious to hear both you and Nicola and David address some of how you built this and how you keep this together and moving forward.
Well, maybe I'll start simply because, as Nicola said, I was one of the very first organizers that was an in-person event. And I want to be really transparent and honest. It was me and then Humboldt State University professor Tony Salvaggio and Ruthie Engelke, my partner. Like we were the ones who really made it happen, right? And again, I'm not trying to break my arm, pat myself on the back. What I'm saying is it really was, a couple of key individuals. And we worked our butts off. Nicola participated as a lecturer, I believe, but she was like, maybe did a session, but wasn't really in the organizing mix. But, because she's a kick-ass labor organizer, we were like, oh, we're doing stuff together. Let's invite Nicola into that. So she became the conference coordinator the first year that we went virtual and has been ever since. And Mark, what I'm getting at is what you're looking at when you look at that amazing sponsorship page is an ongoing building, both evolving, growing, but also deepening process, right? And each year Nicola and I were literally just talking about the fact that, a couple of, like last year, it was like, okay, me, Tony, Nicola, and Ruthie were like, okay, we're the group really holding it together. This year, there are 8 to 10 people representing a bunch of different organizations that are on what we would call like the core anchor team, right? And more coming. So to me, it's another example and reflection of what Nicola was talking about. This is a learning journey, but it's in practice, right? So that's literally the praxis of our theory of organizing, putting it into practice. The summit itself, the conference itself, is an example of what that looks like. So Nicola, I'm curious if you want to, I'd be curious to hear how you answered Mark's very profound question.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think that it's something that I feel we have a conversation about when I am talking about anti-racism and social justice work, which is a major facet of our faculty union organizing in California and our contract negotiations. So the reason why I think that people from different areas are connecting with this conference is because they're seeing something in it that they're connecting to. And that's why when we say sometimes, oh, despite differences, it's actually the inverse of that. It's because of our differences that we are building more connections. And it's, we could say, oh, this is this conference and this is how it's going to look. And we have a vision of things, how it's going to start at the beginning of the year when we start planning. And it totally changes from that. And it's because people are bringing different thoughts and perspectives of, oh, have you thought about this person? Have you connected with these people? And a lot of it is just, no, haven't. That would be amazing. Do you have a connection? And people starting to bring together the people that they know, also propping up Kali Luna, who has been instrumental part of our outreach for sponsorship and support this year. But that kind of network building, I think, is a testament of the celebration of diversity that we're seeing in the sponsorship, but not just the sponsorship, but the presenters and the panelists and the workshops and the different things that we're going to be talking about. It's like people are seeing something here that they want to be a part of, or they feel that they're connected to, and maybe they're coming to the conversation from different perspectives. Like I said earlier, maybe post-capitalism was their home base and they hadn't quite thought about this decolonizing economics question, but that's why we pose it on our website, that this is really a challenge to ourselves to think about how we are actually putting into practice something through conversation and through actual on the ground practice that is moving us towards decolonizing economics, something that we can imagine actually happening, that we're dreaming it into existence. It's this radical imagination, but we're also seeing examples of how it's taking form. And so I think it's exciting. It is funny to see such a wide range of groups coming together. But you know, the second year, or I guess it was like, it's hard to look back on these times, but I think it was the first or second year that we were doing this. We had, oh, it was the first year that we went virtual. After 4 days of sessions, people didn't want to leave. There had been people who'd been hanging out with us for 4 days on Zoom when Zoom was, like we were saying, a new space to be interacting in. And people were there for 4 solid days of Zoom sessions. We would see the same people session after session. And we didn't have these nice built-in breaks between the sessions then. They were back to back to back. And at the end of 4 days, people didn't want to leave. And I think that it's because there is a conversation here that we're not seeing happening in this way elsewhere. And so I'm excited to see where this conversation this year will take us.
Joe, Nicola, and David. Now, I have another set of questions. We began the conversation a bit conceptually, talking about the big concepts guiding it. I'd like to follow in the direction Mark has pushed us in by talking about the range of sponsors, so talking literally about what are the events at the conference. So if you could do three things for me. One, correct me if I'm wrong, did it begin initially as a conference or a gathering of artists to envision post-capitalism, or is that just something I've invented, fabricated? So
You
that's
have
one
it.
question. Okay.
All right, so let me do this one quickly because I could. So the very first thing that Cooperation Humboldt ever did as a public event was an in-person gathering called Artists Dismantling Capitalism. And so that was the genesis, but it was mostly like artists, culture workers, and so forth. And it, to be candid, did not have the level of intellectual and academic rigor that the post-capitalism conference had. So like it's the Artist Dismantling Capitalism has a specific lens around art and culture, but the analysis is part of it. And this one is the inverse. It is mostly the academic river around economics and definition of capitalism and decolonization, with art and culture seeping into it.
Thank you.
And we did have the first year, we had Artists Dismantling Capitalism. We had a session that had happened at that conference that they had done, incorporated into our offerings for the second annual post-capitalism conference. So there has been some really great blending and inspiration that comes from some of the folks that were involved with that effort.
Well, that's great. And I assume they continue to remain connected to your networks and involved perhaps in this conference? Good. So
Yes.
The two other questions I had that are kind of nuts and bolts kind of questions. I know that all the panels are going to be great. Why don't you choose one or two at random and tell us about those panels? The second thing is, I know that the conference has grown over the years. So if you can give us a sense of the numbers of people involved. I'll start with, well, Nicola, why don't you start?
Okay, well, I can give us a picture of numbers, and that's a little hard for me to start thinking about these sessions because really I get so excited, and I know David and I were talking about this earlier in the week that we're going to be pretty much at every single session, as we have been for the last few years. But I'll say that just because we were going to be talking with some, we'd had conversations about Joe Ramsey and thinking about some of the work that has been happening around the labor organizing. One session that I am really interested in, and this kind of shows a little bit of the exploration of, I don't know what this is going to look like, and let's see where the conversation goes. But that's a session that I'm going to be moderating on Friday, the 21st, from 3 to 4:30 Pacific time. And that's Labor Organizing in Higher Education Roundtable. There are two leaders, Sandy Kiwanhaptewa Dixon and Lucy Lee Oliver, who are CFA, Native American Indigenous Peoples Caucus leaders. So they do a lot of the organizing work in our CSU system around how we think about Native sovereignty and incorporating the needs and the concerns of Indigenous faculty within the fabric of our contract and our CFA work broadly. And we're going to be chatting with Naomi R. Williams, who is from Rutgers and also representative of Higher Ed Labor United. So the reason why I thought about this panel in particular is because I am part of this growing movement of labor organizers represented by HULU, Higher Ed Labor United. And this is something that is working on building a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast, unified vision of higher education. We can see the needs of this in all of the battles that are taking place and the 6 or 7 odd strikes that are happening right now, whether at Rutgers in particular, or thinking about Michigan grad workers, or some of the other spaces around the country where the labor actions are taking place. I mean, we're just seeing one after another and drawing inspiration from UAW and grad workers in California recently. All of these things are snowballing. And the thing is that if we're building national movements, just like we're thinking about national conversations, we hope building around decolonizing economics, how do we think about how, just like the post-capitalism conference, do we situate decolonizing economics in that conversation as a key component? How do we build national movements in higher education and incorporate and understand the foundational aspects of Native sovereignty and decolonization in higher education and the legacy of things in this country and how that has shaped our relationships as workers in the current context? These kinds of questions for me are personally like unknown. And I'm not representative of all of HULU, but I'm someone who's constantly trying to push us to be thinking more about anti-racism and social justice and Indigenous epistemology and the focus that is coming from our labor siblings in this direction. So I'm just putting that forward because I'm excited to bring these leaders together. And it's because I don't know how we do the work in Higher Ed Labor United without having more of a conversation specifically around these questions of what our folks have been focusing on and how we integrate that into national movements. And so that's one that I'm very excited about. I'm not even sure if I can pick a second one, because when I go look at the list, it's just everything. But we have amazing stuff like decolonization in the law. Mele Moniz is one organizer who has recently got involved, someone who I just was chatting with outside of having a drink outside of a restaurant, and was someone who was graduating from University of Oregon, focusing on a PhD in law to be completed at the University of Arizona. And Mele's native Hawaiian was asking me, oh, so, brought up something and then was like, something about decolonization. And, for folks that are not, looking at me here, I'm a white woman with those kinds of colonial roots, my mother being from Zimbabwe and my father being from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I have that history of the colonizer in me, but also, as David has been describing, thinking about the work that I'm doing and constantly trying to be more in right relationships. So to have a conversation with someone casually as we're having a meet and greet with lots of people, and I start unpacking what we do at the Decolonizing Economics Summit, turns into a vibrant conversation. And now she's someone who's leading this incredibly robust panel on decolonization in the law that has incredible thinkers from UNM, UCLA, Lakota Law Project, Next System Studies from George Mason University, University of Arizona. And so these names of these people and their work is just, tremendous to be focusing on. So I got long-winded because obviously I'm stoked, but I'll let David talk about some other ones that he's really excited about, because really I want to talk about all of them, and that's why you have to go to the conference. But in terms of our numbers, I mean, last year we had 1,000 registrants, and that completely exceeded our expectations because it was double from our second year. And so this year we're at a place where we're hoping that we're going to be surpassing that 1,000 people in terms of registration. We're already, seeing that kind of, that we're double where we were last year, and we'll see even more people registering next week. And so it's been amazing because, like we were saying, people are wanting to be involved as presenters, but also in terms of participants, we're anticipating registration to continue to grow. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that we're also doing an in-person Earth Day celebration that takes place on Earth Day on April 22nd in McKinleyville, California, and is an opportunity for people to actually come together in person and talk, hear from some of our presenters, actually celebrate with one another, play, be joyful, talk about decolonizing economics. And that has a completely different set of folks that are going to maybe be plugging in virtually, but also will probably, may just be participating in the Earth Day celebration and getting an entry through that. So we sort of are organizing 2 events simultaneously this year. That's just what happened. It wasn't planned in January. It's evolved in that way. It's the yay of collaboration. So that just means that we have a lot of different kinds of offerings. And so we're seeing registration happening in all those different zones. That's a lot.
I might jump in here, but allow David the first reply as a mea culpa for stepping on his speaking point. But I think all of the panels look great. Looking at the schedule, it's a really amazing lineup. But I think for many people, it might be worthwhile at this point to visit one of the first panels that you have scheduled, which is the framing decolonization, and to really ask you to clarify for people what for you is decolonization. How are you thinking about it in this conference? How do you address history and the present and inequities? I mean, it's such a complicated term that I think it's worth hearing from you, David, and you, Nicola, a little bit of unpacking of breaking that out for people before we move on. I hope that makes sense.
Well, look, I will take the challenge and at the same time address Søren's question about like picking 2, right? But I'm going to answer you first, Mark, to say for me, because if you look at the website, the What is Decolonization, that panel is literally described as a series of questions, right? Because it is an acknowledgement and an invitation into the inquiry itself. We do not have a dogmatic program on decolonization. Now, I have a program for building economic institutions, but I do not have, quote, a program on decolonization, because what I know is that is always an individual journey, because the decolonization has to begin by me decolonizing my own mind. Because as Nicola had pointed out, for those of you who are not looking at me, but I am a cisgendered white male and I'm 60 years old, right? So that automatically gives you a bit of positionality for me, right? And so what I know is that I have been bathed in white supremacy and all sorts of advantages associated with it. I have been bathed in patriarchy and all sorts of advantages associated with it. And I also am coming to realize, as Bell Hooks would say, if you understand patriarchy, men are both privileged by patriarchy and profoundly harmed by it as well. And I would argue that white supremacy absolutely gives privileges to people with my pigment, and it comes at a very heavy, heavy cost, because it literally robs of the basic humanity that we're supposed to have by giving this kind of privilege associated with white skin and constantly pitting folk against each other. Now, for example, the word whiteness, you know where the concept of whiteness was actually created? This continent. Why? Because of Bacon's rebellion. And because there was not just Nat Turner and one rebellion. Guess what? When you enslave people, enslaved people fight back and try to get free, right? And the point is that indentured white, they weren't called white, right? They were called Scots or Irish or English, poor English, right? But they were indentured servants, and they realized that the enslaved Africans and indentured servants, although there was a degree of difference, they were both being exploited or oppressed. And there were so many examples of working class solidarity trying to get free. And the ruling elite said, oh no, there's way more of them than there are of us. What can we do? So they created whiteness. Literally under law in the 1600s, you'll see the description of literally legal privileges, and they called them the privilege of being white in order. Now, did the ruling elite and the English noblemen who were the colonists there bring up all the working class indentured servants to the same level as them? Hell no. They just brought them up enough and then literally degraded the enslaved African even more in order to separate on class. It was a divide and conquer, very conscious effort. And as a person with white skin privilege, I tell folk all the time, if you think that the ruling elite have any allegiance to you, let me do a thought experiment with you. Why don't you and I as white people go knock on the door of the country club and say, hey, we ain't got no money, but we're white. Can we swim in the swimming pool with you? And see how they treat you. Make no mistake about it. The ruling elite are our class enemies. And I've got way more in common with Sir Mudliar as a working class revolutionary than I do with anybody who happens to have my pigment and tries to play some white supremacy as a privilege to me. Fuck those people. They're my enemy. So that's my decolonizing journey. So with that,
I was like, oh, you're bringing in some W.E.B. Du Bois and helping us to think about this stuff. Like, yes, going back to like political education 101 for us here.
And with that, Mark, that's the answer to your question. Sir, and I'm going to do your question a little more quickly. The first one, what is to be done? And for those of you who have done some political education yourself, you'll recognize we're not hiding. That's a hat tip to Vladimir Lenin, right? His famous pamphlet, What is to be Done? Burning Questions of Our Movement, written in 1902, where he literally was saying, how can we move beyond the, quote, single issues of working hours? How do we move beyond economic battles over individuals and literally restructure society? So I would argue today, as we're seeing global ecological collapse, as we're seeing not just late stage, but end stage capitalism, and as we're seeing fascism emerge, the question, what is to be done, is a profoundly important one. And the people, Kali Akuno moderating, bringing in Blair Evans of Insight Focus, who's at the cutting edge of digital fabrication, and also Egget Batru of Community Movement Builders, one of the leaders of Stop Cop City in Atlanta, and bringing in Michelle Edelman McCormick of Cooperation Vermont, and bringing in Professor Rick Wolf of Democracy at Work, arguably the most famous economic Marxist alive today, to answer that question. And I'll take this opportunity to reckon, here's where I do have a program. What is to be done? Decommodify the land, decolonize the land, make sure that land is available for both housing and food production and distribution using indigenous practices, and build worker-owned cooperatives, but not co-ops for the sake of co-ops, but co-ops to both do commerce and also teach ourselves the democratic arts of making and implementing decisions democratically, and infusing all of that with political education and art and culture and play. That is what is to be done.
David, and there I was thinking that David's gotten too comfortable at this.
I know.
I was clearly very wrong. Uh, you know, I do want to think about how we move forward in this conversation. There are still a number of issues that I think we'd like to cover. We're at about the 55-minute mark. I also would like to involve some of the folks who come in. And to my pleasant surprise, there's a friend who's joined the show who I think can really speak to some of these questions that you've raised from a very different vantage point. And I'd like to involve him a little bit later. So I do want to get to the question, though, of you deciding to carve out a space to think, right? So it's very clear that, you know, if we think of David and Nicola, we're thinking about organizers, people of action, right? People who will get things done. And yet you very deliberately carved out the space for thinking and strategizing, starting out with a cultural program initially, but evolving to thinking about these questions in a very considered, and occasionally I've even heard the word academic way. So, you're not shrinking from that word as if it's something that activists should not, organizers should not be doing. I know also that very recently, even though you're all on the left coast, David was on the right coast a little while ago at a Next System Studies conference. How does this conference relate to the academic world? And by the way, this question is a setup for involving somebody else who's in the show. So I don't know who would like to start. Nicola, would you like to start?
Sure. And I do want to also point our attention to the beginning, like we had been talking about that framing, what is meant by decolonization. I also want to encourage people to come to that opening session, because the opening session really is an opportunity to get a feel for what has been taking place with the conference organizing, as well as hear from incredible leaders from the Wiyot tribe, and to learn about what's going on with big projects like Dishgamu Community Land Trust, actual land back projects. And so some of the people who I know are on that panel who joined us last year were incredibly inspiring and took us on a journey that, you know, we could actually be out in the land, like actually on land that couldn't be disclosed, that was being restored by the tribe, and just amazing inroads of just like exploration of what is happening and what can be done. And so come to the first session if you're curious about what this looks like, if you're trying to filter all these things of like, what's our colonial history? And oh my God, I hadn't thought about these things, and our wages of whiteness and all this legacy stuff that's going into our lives today. Come to the conference and come explore it and what is being offered. But when we're talking about like, how does this fit academically? I mean, this is a question that is just constantly in the classroom with us. What is to be done? Where do we go from here? Okay, Nicola, you told us all semester that capitalism is destroying the earth, but what happens after that? And any time in history, if we look at times that we've been looking for transition or playing with alternatives, we're exploring the unknown of what that could look like. And we're also questioning, how do we fulfill the critique that we have in practical terms without undermining the goals that we have in mind? And so just drawing forward Audre Lorde's words, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, in 1979, created a lot of this framing of, how do we decolonize when we know that the roots of colonization are entangled in so many spaces? And higher education is not exempt from that. In fact, higher education has been in a massive transformation since the 1970s as things have gotten less white, less male dominated, more about working faculty, workers' experiences in higher education, where we have explosion of contingency. That means people who are the sort of just in time workforce, lecturers like myself who are operating on I'm a lucky one with a 1-year contract right now, as opposed to a semester by semester contract. And the 75 percent of faculty who are in situations like myself across this country. Now, what happens when we start trying to talk about things like knowing what we know and sharing what we know in the classroom, i.e. academic freedom? When you're a lecturer who doesn't have job security, being able to speak about what you know and speak forcibly with strength about that history, just like what David shared with us, could be an insecure position to be in as a faculty member, especially being a woman, especially being a person of color, especially being differently abled, especially being an immigrant, especially being all these other identities that characterize our higher education workforce today. And we're the folks who are supposed to be teaching the people, right? And thinking about how we contribute to a democracy where we have access to knowing a multiplicity of thought, exploring different experiences and backgrounds. How do we talk about things that are constantly, through we're seeing the attacks on higher education today, working to force academic freedom out of the classroom, working to make people who are not that traditional white male professorship insecure, disposable, exploited. These kinds of things are happening. And so if we're going to be thinking long term about what it looks like to be in the United States in a democratic system, well, now I'm chuckling because I'm laughing about democracy. But if we have any hope of really having democratic participation in this country in a real way that's transformative, that protects people, social justice experiences, and the realities of the people that we love in our communities, then we need to have access to education, not this neoliberalized bullshit, privatized education model that is based off of reducing faculty, students, and everything else to units. We need to actually think about, what does education look like? What is it actually for? Is it just teaching our students to follow the leader, to take instructions, and to go out into the job force and keep their heads down and not ask any questions? Well, that's not the type of education that I'm invested in when I show up in the classroom. But we don't have a system right now that is allowing that kind of exploration. Forget celebrating it. Forget celebrating the diversity. And so I see this as foundational to actually transforming our educational, transforming our realities outside of the academy, but seeing the role that higher education has to play in that, because this is something that, students with, the expansion of higher education post-World War II, we are educating more students in higher education institutions than ever before. And so this is an opportunity to get access to ethnic studies or get access to different kinds of learning that we've had to fight for. And we've had to pass bills over in California to build that into the fabric of our education. So, it's just, to me, it's foundational. It's fundamental to the democracy. It's fundamental to actually being able to heal society or heal ourselves, heal the earth and the relationship there. And so this is academic, perhaps, but it is at our core. And so I'm fighting for this in higher ed, and that's why I do all the labor organizing that I'm doing, is because I see the connections of workers to the educational experiences that my students are getting. And I want it to be vibrant at the end of the day. And it's not for any of us right now, and it needs to change.
Right. I thank you so much. Complicated issues, many conversations to continue, and that's always a good place to wrap one conversation to a close. I would like to thank Nicola and David so much for taking their time this evening to share with us. I am looking forward to the conference coming up. I would also like to thank our guests and participants who came this evening. Thank you so much, and I'm so glad to have you here for the reboot of Shelter in Solidarity, coming back after a hiatus. I would like to remind people of a couple of things. Remember, we do have a Facebook page. If you are a social media person, please, visit and share. That's the only, word of mouth is the only way we get the word about the shows out. You can also watch our shows on YouTube. All of our archive is there. And our website is shelterinsolidarity.org. Just to remind you, the Saturday bookshelf show that we do on noons, the last Saturday of the month, will be also restarting. Our next show will be April 29th. Our guest is Jenny Bonnevier from the University of Örebro in Sweden, who will be coming to talk about materialist feminism and speculative fiction, and her recently edited volume on kinship in the fiction of N.K. Jemisin, Relations of Power and Resistance. N.K. Jemisin is an amazing author, Afrofuturist, so if you haven't read her and come to the show. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Community Church of Boston in Quattro Cinco or E5, Hardball Press, and the journal Socialism and Democracy for their continued support, and wish everyone a wonderful evening. And again, thank you so much for a stimulating conversation. We look forward to more at Shelter in Solidarity in the future.